Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We'll go ahead and get started. So just a quick flag, all materials and resources for this training will be posted, the link shown here on this slide, and all forms and guidelines that we reference are also posted on our website. So first, to flag some important dates for you, you see here the list of trainings. So for your LEAs for which your students are enrolled, their test coordinators have already attended this training. So you are hearing what they heard and you should be able to hopefully successfully coordinate. School test plans are due 15 days prior to the first day of the test window. And we will talk a little bit about windows further, but there's flexibility on when folks test within a window, but the school plan, which is the plan, and we will certainly discuss this in more detail as well, the plan that talks about the testing procedures at your school site are due 15 days prior to the first day of the testing window, and they are due to OSSE on that timeline. You see the park windows below. The first window opens up on the 28th of March. There's one on the 4th of April and one on the 11th of April. The science window is May 2nd to June 3rd. And affidavits, and we will certainly discuss those in more detail as well, will be due 15 days after test administration. Just a quick housekeeping note, we wanted to mention we will leave some time for questions in between each section. So we certainly will have the chat function. We'll be looking at it in between each section. So if you have a question, feel free to email, or if you want to look at it live or want to potentially post it live, you can put it in the chat feature and we will answer some questions in between each of the sections. So what we want to start out with is test integrity. OSSE's goal is for schools and local education agencies to deliver a uniform and equitable statewide assessment program. For assessments to yield fair and accurate results, the assessments must be administered in consistent and standardized conditions. The best way to ensure that occurs is to ensure educators understand and recognize acceptable and unacceptable assessment practice. And so I say this because I want to frame, we don't just do testing integrity for integrity's sake or for the sake of paperwork. We really believe and we encourage folks to have equal access to the assessments and to have equal access and opportunity to show what they know. And one way to do that is to ensure that the environment is the same for all students. So that's why this is so important. We want to make sure that the data that comes out on the other side of this is really reflective of what our students know and are able to do and are reflective of nothing else. So delving a little bit deeper into test integrity, and that's what we're going to talk about in the first section of this webinar because it's very important and we want to make sure that we have clearly communicated and talked to you all about responsibilities around testing integrity. When we say statewide assessments, we mean PARC, which is the ELA and math assessment, DC Science, which is required for all students in grades 5, 8, and students taking high school biology. The DC Science Alternative is for those students with significant cognitive disabilities, again, in grades 5, 8, and high school biology. And the NCSIC, or the MSAA, the Multi-State Alternate Assessment, for those students with significant cognitive disabilities. This is the math and reading assessment. OSSE prefers the term statewide when we talk about these assessments. DC Official Code and the Testing Integrity Act and its amendment use the term district-wide. For the purposes of this webinar, the terms are equivalent. And these assessments are required by local and federal law for all students in publicly funded DC education. And so when we talk about test integrity, these are the assessments to which test integrity processes, forms, all of those good things apply. So when we talk about testing responsibilities, we're going to talk about responsibilities and roles to start out here. OSSE's role and responsibility is to establish policy, regulations, and guidelines to ensure that statewide assessments are administered with fidelity, which is that first point we talked about, making sure that the data that comes out is only reflective of what students know and are able to do. We are responsible for training and supporting LEAs in schools and administering the statewide assessment, which again, those 4 assessments that were on the previous slide. We are responsible for reviewing and approving school test plans, for monitoring the assessments, and for conducting the test integrity review, the investigation process once testing has concluded. LEAs, local education agencies, so these are your charter organizers and DCPS. For all schools and campuses under that LEA's purview, the LEA is responsible for filing school test plans that schools create with OSSE, for designating authorized personnel, and we will certainly define authorized personnel in a few slides. LEAs must ensure authorized personnel are trained. They must distribute the testing integrity and security notification statement, monitor the assessments, report and investigate any breaches of test security, and collect and submit the testing integrity affidavits from schools to OSSE. School testing responsibilities. So here's something I want to really call out. For the purposes of test integrity, non-public placement, non-public sites are considered schools. So when we're talking to this population, please be paying extra special, careful attention to anything where we say school responsibility, school role, because we are seeing non-public placements as schools for the purposes of testing and test integrity. So schools, non-public placements, are responsible for creating and submitting school test security plans to their LEAs. We understand that some of you have students who come from multiple LEAs, and so you would need to turn a test plan into each LEA for whom you have students enrolled. Schools and non-public placements are responsible for protecting the security of secure materials, administering the statewide assessment to all eligible and applicable students, maintaining a test security file, ensuring the integrity of the testing environment, reporting any breaches of security, and signing and submitting test security affidavits to your LEAs. Only the test integrity coordinator or the test monitor at the school site needs to sign that affidavit, and we'll talk about that in more detail as well. So what governs test integrity? There are a few key documents that are widely available online, and we'll talk about them here as well. We have the Testing Integrity Act of 2013 and the Test Integrity Act Amendment, which was issued in 2015. They are local DC law. They apply to all students who are DC publicly funded students, and it governs those 2 documents are current local legislation about conditions for testing. We also have the OSSE Test Integrity Guidelines, which is OSSE policy and requirements around the assessments, and the vendor test directions. So from Pearson and from MSAA, the directions that come from those test vendors, those must be followed. So all of these documents must be followed and complied with. We also have a link there for access to these documents and for additional forms. So we're going to talk a little bit about each of those documents, just pulling out the highlights. And I want to let you know that we're not going to read through every slide, but we do want to make sure that we have talked about those things that are really, really important. And we want to make sure that you all have heard it directly from us. So the Testing Integrity Act of 2013 defines terms and roles. So things like test integrity coordinator, test monitor, authorized personnel. There's a whole definition section there that's very clear and explicit about who does what and what things mean. It also discusses LEA and school requirements and OSSE requirements. It discusses things and mandates things like school plans, reports and investigations, affidavits, and anti-retaliation. It defines OSSE requirements around training and standards. It requires us to review test plans, and it requires us to monitor and investigate. The Test Integrity Act also makes explicit that certain actions that provide students inappropriate advantage on the assessment may result in sanctions. Sanctions for the LEA, sanctions for the school, and any individuals when we find, if there's a finding that these prohibited actions were done knowingly and willfully. The Test Integrity Act Amendment makes some key changes to the Test Integrity Act. It defines district-wide assessments as those that are used for accountability. So again, that's the PARC, the MSAA, NCSIC, DC Science, and DC Science Alt. And it clarifies that only those assessments are subject to Test Integrity Act requirements. The amendment also shifts test plan creation and submission from an LEA responsibility to a school responsibility. Schools must create those plans at the school level and submit them to the LEA, who then submits them to OSSE. It shifts the timeline of test plan submission from 90 days to 15 days prior to the assessment, and again, that's when OSSE receives them, 15 days prior to the window. It requires OSSE to approve the test plans 5 days prior to the assessment. It allows use of approved electronics for testing. We'll talk about that more as well, but we wanted to make sure, because it's a computer-based test, that computers were allowed in the testing environment for testing purposes. So that is the intent of that piece of the amendment. It requires OSSE to provide training and guidance 45 days prior to testing. And it shifts what we used to call the non-disclosure agreement, or the NDA that folks sign to say, I know and understand, to a notification statement. You no longer have to sign an NDA and turn it in. You simply have to receive it and ensure that all authorized personnel receive it. That form is available online, and it basically just states, here are the prohibited actions, and here is what happened if you knowingly and willfully commit one of the prohibited actions. The test security guidelines, this is an OSSE document, again this is online, is explanation and additional details of the Act and OSSE policy. It further defines OSSE roles and responsibilities, LEA and school roles and responsibilities, provides some specific information about the test environment, and details processes for monitoring and investigations. Each of the assessments will have test vendor instructions that have things like time of test, how long the units are, scripts for test administrators to read, and folks should follow those very closely. So now we're going to talk a little bit about roles. Some of the key roles that are defined both in OSSE policy and in the Test Integrity Act are authorized personnel, a test integrity coordinator, test monitor, administrator, and there are other optional roles like proctor, special education coordinator, alternate assessment director, and technology coordinator. Authorized personnel are our biggest bucket of folks who are involved in assessment. Any individual who has access to statewide assessment materials or who are directly involved in the administration of a statewide assessment are considered authorized personnel. And this is defined in the Test Integrity Act. So anyone in your building involved in statewide testing in any way is authorized personnel. The requirements that go with being authorized personnel are that anyone under this umbrella, anyone involved in testing must complete testing integrity training developed by OSSE, which is this PowerPoint. They must receive the testing integrity and security notification statement, again, what we used to call the NDA. Now it's the statement. Folks must receive that. Authorized personnel must report any breach of test security, cooperate in investigations, refrain from prohibited activities, and read all applicable directions and guidance. So one thing to think about is if you have folks who are in the testing environment, they will need to be authorized personnel. If you need to have a light bulb changed, that person who comes and changes a light bulb, if it happens during testing, should be authorized personnel. So under the umbrella of authorized personnel, there are more specific roles. So all the roles that I'm going to discuss here, test integrity coordinator, monitor, all of those are additionally authorized personnel. The test integrity coordinator is the individual designated by the LEA to be responsible for testing integrity and security for that LEA and all of the schools and campuses under its purview. So at DCPS, at your charter organizer, there's one person designated for the local education agency to be responsible for testing at all of the campuses. And this will be your main point of contact for the LEA. This should be the person that you're working with for the LEA for which you have enrolled students. The Test Integrity Coordinator designates and supports test monitors, attend testing security and integrity training. They submit the school test plans for all of the schools and campuses under its purview to OSSE, so that includes non-publics. It should be the LEA Test Integrity Coordinator should be submitting your school test plan for your non-public site to OSSE with its other school plans. The Test Integrity Coordinator should be supporting test monitors, monitoring test administration at schools, reporting breaches of security or deviations from school test plans, investigating, documenting, and reporting to OSSE any breach or deviation, signing, collecting, and submitting testing integrity affidavits for all of their schools to OSSE. Next, we have the test monitor, and here's where, again, this is a school level responsibility, so this is particularly applicable to this group. The test monitor is the individual designated by the test integrity coordinator to be responsible for testing integrity and security for the school or campus site. So for each non-public placement, there should be one test monitor who is responsible for testing and testing integrity at that site. This person must create and submit the school test plan to the LEA Test Integrity Coordinator. This person must conduct test administration training for all authorized personnel at the site. So anyone who's going to be authorized personnel at your site, you should be training. It is your responsibility to create and disseminate the school test plan. Make sure that all your authorized personnel are aware of the plan and the processes for testing. Overseeing security of all secure materials while they are in the school site. Supporting other authorized personnel while administering the test at your site, and signing and submitting affidavits to the Test Integrity Coordinator post-testing. So only the test monitor and the Testing Integrity Coordinator are required to sign the affidavit. So if you are the only test monitor at your school site, you are the only person who needs to sign, but you do need to submit that to your LEA Testing Integrity Coordinator. And the affidavit is available online. Basically, it says, I acknowledge that we did all the things in compliance with laws and plans with the following exceptions if you had a breach of security or if you had a deviation and you detail it. It basically says, I tried my hardest to do the right thing and everything happened the right way to the best of my knowledge. Test administrators are those individuals identified by the test monitor to be responsible for actually administering the assessment to students. So this person must conduct testing sessions as outlined in the test administrator manuals, establish the testing climate within the test location or class or room. They must coordinate distribution and return of testing materials to and from students. So they should be getting the materials that students need, getting them to students, collecting them from students, and making sure that they're securely stored, disposed of, whatever the directions dictate. Test administrators should ensure that students who require accommodations receive those appropriate accommodations in their testing group, and account for and maintain the security of all testing materials under the test administrator's purview, so that they are protecting those secure materials while the test administrator has them. Other optional roles, schools may have test proctors in a testing room to assist the test administrator with administration, classroom management. They take direction from the test administrator. They can help with things like handing out materials, escorting students to the bathroom, just another set of eyes. A proctor is not required, but it is certainly allowable. The test proctor, again, should be authorized personnel and meet all the requirements therein. Folks can have a special education coordinator or alternate assessment coordinator who's responsible for accommodations and alt testing and making sure that test administrators who have students who require accommodations, that those test administrators are familiar with administering those accommodations so they can administer them appropriately. You can also have a technology coordinator who assists you in preparing to administer computer-based testing, who helps prepare the devices and troubleshoots any technology problems. Again, these are optional roles. They are allowable roles. They are all authorized personnel. So now we're going to go from documents to roles to key tasks. So certainly these are not 100% comprehensive, but again, these are those key things that we want to make sure that we've communicated and that you are thinking about as you prepare. So for this section, we have sort of a cheat sheet graph on the first slide, and we're going to deep dive into each of those bulleted pieces. Here's a link to the testing security and integrity notification statement, which all authorized personnel must receive. Again, no need to sign it and collect it. Folks just have to receive it. So one of the key before testing tasks is to create a school test plan. Every school must submit a school test plan to their LEA or LEAs. Non-public schools serving multiple LEAs must submit separate plans to each. That plan can be identical with the exception of the applicable student roster. The processes can be the same. they must be submitted to each LEA. Every LEA then submits school test plans for all the schools and campuses under its purview to OSSE at least 15 days prior to the first day of testing. So you need to make sure that you are getting your test plan to your LEA in time for them to submit to OSSE 15 days prior. And so you'll certainly want to coordinate with your LEA about what their preferred process is. There's no specific format or template required by OSSE, but school plans must contain the following information: school information, a staff roster for those involved in testing, testing dates, a calendar, when, where is testing happening, policies and procedures for ensuring the environment is secure, assurances that DC and OSSE requirements will be met. We have provided a template in Excel. It is not required that folks use this template, but using this template will ensure that you've hit all those areas that are required. Certainly, you'll also want to coordinate with your LEA to make sure that if they have any additional requirements in addition to what the state requires, that you are meeting those requirements. Additionally, this year schools are required to follow OSSE instructions for documenting and naming test sessions and test administrators in Pearson Access Next, and there are instructions linked below. Another key before testing task is the local test administration training. Again, you are responsible for training authorized personnel in your building on school policy and procedures and on state policy and law. At this training, it's a good idea to distribute the testing integrity and security notification statement to all authorized personnel so you know that you've distributed it, and you can have a sign-in sheet to make sure that you have a record of who has received the notification. You should be reviewing your school test plan at the training so that everyone's on the same page about what's going to happen and how. It's a good idea to review the test security guidelines so that folks know what the requirements from the state are, test administration procedures for your building, and review of the testing manuals, and making sure that everyone knows where they can go and that everyone feels confident in being able to do their job during test administration and what resources they have available to them. You want to make sure people feel as comfortable as possible and have as much information as possible to do their job. Another key task is notifying students and families what the purpose of testing is, when it's happening, encouraging them to be positive, to do their best, that this is something that we do, but it doesn't define them, making sure that accommodations are addressed. We also want to make sure that our families know that students will be testing and that they are entitled to accommodations if that's appropriate. And we have a template online. Now we'll shift into during testing tasks. Some key tasks are reporting, documenting minor deviations from the testing plan in the school security file. The school security file is simply a file. It can be paper, it can be electronic, it can be a combination where you keep all of your key testing documents. We would want you to keep any deviations from your school plan in addition to your school plan in that file. You're also required to report security incidents. So if there's a breach of security, you are required to inform OSSE. OSSE has an online form that's a copy of the test integrity or testing incident form, which you can use. You can type into, and we will get that. Also, the OSSE support tool, which LEAs have access to. The form is available there, and then we can do secure transmission over that OSSE support tool. You can also call OSSE. We will have a number for folks if there's a question or if you need additional support in reporting an incident. Our forms are also available online for you to download and print out, so if folks need to write it down hard copy in the moment, they have that available to them. Detailing a little bit more about that security file. The security file, again, can be paper, can be electronic, so long as folks know where it is, how to access it. It must contain the school test plan, documentation of any changes to the plan or deviations from the plan, including things like change in makeups, copies of any incident forms, documentation of any irregularities, Documentation of recommendations for invalidated student scores. If something happened where you think a student score should be invalidated, you would want to make sure that that note is in your school security file. Chain of custody documentation that evidences that secure materials were appropriately shepherded throughout the process and kept secure. Any test administration concerns or notes, and any missing secure materials. This must be kept on file for 4 years. Again, can be electronic, can be hard copy, can be a combination. You want to make sure that more than you knows where it is and how to access it. When we do test and integrity investigations, we come out to school sites and we ask for this file, we ask for the plan. So you want to make sure that folks have access to it and they know where it is. Not everyone is investigated. We do investigations based on statistical flagging and also random selection, but you want to make sure that if you're ever in that position, you have everything documented. And I think my advice here is to just document as much as possible. You want to be in a position where if there's ever a question about the integrity of your assessment, that you can have documentation of anything that maybe didn't happen according to plan, but that you've got that rationale, you've got that documentation. You can say, well, here's why this happened this way, or here's why this didn't happen exactly according to plan, so that there's not even the appearance of impropriety. Administration monitoring. Both OSSI and the LEA are responsible for monitoring the assessments in the school sites. We want to make sure that environments are set up appropriately. And so OSSI comes out and does monitoring, and certainly you want to talk to your LEA about what their expectations are, but OSSI does send monitors. When OSSI sends monitors, they are strictly there to observe. They have a form that they use that we share with, that we post to our website. We're just there to watch. We don't want to scare anybody. We don't mean to make anyone anxious. We're just there to watch. So the test is done. What happens now? Affidavits. We talked about these a little bit. The link is right here. Again, that's a verifying that and attesting that everything happened according to plan, and if it didn't, that you've appropriately documented it. So some hot topics. These are questions that always come up. Non-public placements, particularly applicable to this group. LEAs must ensure that all eligible students enrolled at their LEA, including students in your non-public sites, are participating in statewide assessments. It is a requirement of both local and federal law. Non-publics are considered a school or a campus under the purview of the LEA. As such, non-public placements must comply with the Testing Integrity Act of 2013, the amendment, the test security guidelines, vendor manuals, and also LEA policy as applicable. The non-public placement must create and submit to their LEAs of enrollment the school test plan for students at that site. So this is what's been shared with your LEAs. They are expecting plans from you, and they are expecting you to coordinate with them. Testing environment and materials. This is always a hot topic. What can we have on the walls and what can we not have on the walls? Wall displays with tested content or test-taking strategies must be covered or removed for the duration of testing. A periodic table of elements would be considered tested content during the science assessment. Things like that. If there's ever a question, you're probably best served to cover or remove if it's on the line. Students may have activities unrelated to the tested content after testing materials have been collected. So if you have a group of students in a testing room and half are finished and they've turned their materials into the test administrator and half are still working, those students that have finished may have homework, they may have reading, they may have an activity, so long as it's not related to the content that's currently being tested. So if the students are taking the ELA assessment, they can be doing math work, they can be doing science work, they can be coloring, they can be reading a book, so long as it's not a book on ELA. They can be doodling. One thing to note here is that if students are doodling, you will want to collect and destroy the doodle paper before they exit the testing room. So may not go on the fridge, must be destroyed if that's what they are working on. Students may not have non-vendor provided support materials, things like dictionaries, thesauruses, reference guides, formulas, unless specified in the student's IEP, 504, or English language plan, or again, provided by the vendor. So some exceptional circumstances. Absences and makeups. Make sure that if there are students who are absent or are doing makeup, that that's included and captured in your calendar, that you've thought about when you're going to hold makeups, what you're going to do for student absences. Make sure that you're documenting that, you know who's testing when. For students who are homebound, the test monitor at the school site or the non-public site can work with the test integrity coordinator at the LEA to figure out how best to include those homebound students in statewide assessment, and then notify OSSE of how you plan to get that done. Testing at alternative sites, same as above, working with the test integrity coordinator and notifying OSSE. We most commonly see requests for testing at alternative sites if there is particularly we've seen it most common with behavior issues, students who may not be at the school site the same time as other folks. There's a whole range of reasons, but that's the one we most commonly see, is that student cannot be at that site at the same time as other folks for whatever reason. Again, you can work with the test integrity coordinator and with OSSE to determine the best way to include that student in statewide testing. Maybe looking at a library or the student's home. Just working with the student, working with the LEA to determine the best course there. Homeschooled students, I think this is less applicable for the non-public crowd, but if you have a student who is homeschooled and they approach you saying, I would like this student to be included in your testing, you are not required to test homeschooled students who request to participate in the assessment. You can send them to their DCPS district school, and they should have notified folks by March 1st. So if that request does come to you, you can certainly route that family to OSSE, or you can route them to DCPS. They should be, they can be included in DCPS's testing at the student's home district. For significant medical emergencies that occur with students during testing, the school and the LEA may apply for a medical exemption with support from a physician. The bar on this is extremely high. The exemption would need to be for the whole test window, which means that a student would need to be medically unable to test for the duration of the testing window. Typically, we see things like major concussions. A student may be out of the building, sometimes receiving things like chemotherapy, and they're not able to test. The bar, again, is fairly significant and must be validated by a physician. So this is reserved for really severe instances where a student is medically unable to participate. Any other emergency, we certainly want to make clear that student safety comes first. If there is a fire in the building, get the students out. We certainly are concerned about the integrity of materials, but we are more concerned about the well-being of children. So if there's an emergency in your building, please ensure student safety first, but be thinking about, as you're planning, if there's some kind of emergency, what are our procedures? And then certainly document and submit to OSSE as an incident if something like that does occur. Electronics, always a big topic of discussion. Cell phones may not be used in the testing environment by students or test administrators. They're strictly prohibited for students and test administrators in the testing environment. During the administration of paper-based tests, no cell phones may be in the testing environment at any point by anybody during testing. During the administration of computer-based tests, school test monitors and school technology coordinators may use cell phones for technical support. If a student is unable to test, their computer is not, or their device is not working, the test monitor or the school technology coordinator may be on their phone getting assistance from Pearson or from OSSE so that that student is able to use that device, or that we're able to mitigate that technological issue. Grade level appropriate calculators will be available through the test platform on calculator sections of the mathematics assessment for computer-based tests. Students may also use handheld grade appropriate calculators on calculator sections of assessments, paper or computer-based. No calculators, however, are allowed on non-calculator sections except when specified by a student's IEP, and the test directions will tell you when calculators are allowable for all students. Accommodations. It is very important that accommodations and accessibility features on the assessment are also used in instruction. We do not want a situation in which a student is trying to learn how to use an accommodation or an accessibility feature for the first time on the test. That would be an instance in which we are not assessing what a student knows and is able to do on the content. We are assessing how well they understand how to use an accommodation. So please make sure that students are well versed in how to use their accommodations and accessibility features prior to the assessment. Any unique or non-standard accommodation not included in manuals for an assessment must be approved by OSSE prior to their use on statewide tests, and we have a form available on our website for consideration. Again, we're going to hit this nail again. Students must be familiar and comfortable with all necessary accommodations before the assessment. For the park, there's practice tests and tutorials that students can take advantage of in order to practice these accommodations and features. An emergency accommodations form will be available online for temporary accommodations in the event of a student injury. If something happens, student breaks their wrist on their dominant hand, they can't write or use a mouse, that would be something where we would consider an emergency accommodation. Guidelines for selecting, implementing, and evaluating the use of accommodations for students with disabilities and English language learners can be found on our website. Everyone's favorite, what can you not do? What is 100% prohibited by the Test Integrity Act? I'm going to read through these because we want to be really explicit that knowingly and willingly doing any of the following things is in violation of the Test Integrity Act. Folks may not photocopy, reproduce, disclose secure items or materials. Folks may not review, read, or look at test items or student responses unless it's specifically permitted. Do not look at test materials. Do not look at student responses. You may not assist students with answers to questions, verbal and nonverbal cues. You want to make sure that there's not even the appearance of this happening. Be careful of things like tapping on a desk, tapping a student's shoulder. That could be considered a nonverbal cue, so please just be aware of that. You want to avoid even the appearance of impropriety. You may not alter student responses. You may not alter test procedures and formal instructions. If there is a script, you must read it word for word. You may not allow students to use notes, references, or other aids unless specifically allowed by the vendor instructions or by a student's IEP 504 or EL plan. You may not have in your personal possession secure test materials except during scheduled testing time. You may not allow students to view or practice secure test items before or after scheduled testing. You may not make or have an answer key for unreleased test items or test forms. You may not leave secure test materials in non-secure locations or unattended by unauthorized personnel. You may not use unapproved electronics during the assessment, and we talked a little bit earlier about approved electronics. Knowingly and willfully doing any of those prohibited actions can result in sanctions, and sanctions may be at the LEA, school, or individual level. By school and LEA, we mean if there is a systematic violation that's being fostered systematically by that school or LEA. If we find a violation at the school LEA level, we may require that the LEA or school pay expenses incurred as a result of the violation, any investigation costs. OSSE may levy an administrative fine against the school or the LEA and or may invalidate student test scores. Individuals, if they knowingly and willingly violate the Test Integrity Act, OSSE may deny, suspend, revoke, cancel, or place restrictions on the issuance or renewal of an OSSE-issued license for a minimum of 1 year for that individual. OSSE may also require payment of expenses incurred as a result of the violation. Again, things like investigative costs, time that folks took to identify the violation. And or OSSE may levy an administrative fine against the individual. So those bulleted act violations, don't do them. Avoid the appearance. So we're going to take a quick pause here for questions. Again, if you have a question, please type it in the chat. We will try to answer questions as best as possible. If you've typed a question in and we haven't responded, we can annually we always put out an FAQ document. So if you don't see or hear your question answered during this time, please check back to OSSE's website for the FAQ. First question is, will the PowerPoint be available later? Absolutely. It will be posted on our website, and we will make sure that attendees of this webinar get a copy of links used in this webinar and a copy of the slides. Question is, what is the grade criteria for MSAA? Is very similar to the grade requirements for PARCC. Students in grades 3 through 8 and once in high school is a federal requirement. For PARCC, that's 3 through 8, students in grades 3 through 8 and students taking geometry or English 2. For MSAA, it's students grades 3 through 8 and 11th grade students. Can the test integrity coordinator be the same person as the testing monitor? The answer is yes, at a single campus LEA. So if the LEA just has one site, then the testing coordinator and the testing monitor could be the same person. If it's a multi-campus LEA, the testing integrity coordinator could be monitor at one site, but not at all of the sites, because each site needs to have its own monitor. There's a question about if a student is done testing in a room, may they be dismissed instead of doing an alternate activity in the testing room? Absolutely. Students who have completed the test and turned their secured materials back into the test administrator may either do an alternate activity, as we discussed, or they may be dismissed to another location. Question about what grades have calculator sections in their math tests? Grades 6 and above in some units require calculators. Question about, again, for required assessments, for PARCC testing, are we expected to test English 9 and English 10 and Algebra 1 and Geometry? The state required PARCC tests are Geometry and English 2. All other high school assessments are optional. So just those students who are enrolled in English 2 or who are enrolled in high school geometry are required to assess for the PARCC. One note here is that's the state requirement. Your LEA may require additional high school assessments, and so if you have high school students, you'll want to check with the LEA about what that LEA requires. Again, the state requirement is geometry and English 2. Some LEAs require additional high school assessments, so you want to check with them. You must comply with what your LEA's policy decision is around high school test requirements. There's a question about, do grades 3 through 5 not need calculators? Students in grades 3 through 5 for the PARCC do not need calculators unless they have a calculator accommodation in their IEP. Again, we'll leave questions open for another minute or so. If you did not hear your question answered, either we will post the answer in the FAQ or we will follow up with you. It seemed like a potentially unique question. So either, if you didn't hear your question answered, we will follow up with you individually or we will make sure that it is incorporated into our FAQ document. There's a question, is English 2 the same as English 10? For PARCC, yes, those two terms are interchangeable. English 2 and English 10 are the same thing for PARCC. There is no second grade PARCC.
Sorry, hi everybody. Brief technical difficulty with the mic there. So we're going to close out this section around test integrity and test security. If you have follow-up questions that come to mind, feel free to either follow up with us or type them in the question box, and we'll get to them later on if we can. I know there were a few questions we weren't able to answer at this moment, simply because I know we're going to address them later in the training. So if we don't get to them, we will circle back. But otherwise, we're going to move on to cover a variety of tasks for before, during, and after testing. So again, this is Bonnie O'Keefe. I'm the park coordinator for DC. Our general agenda for the before, during, after training sections, we're not going to cover every single task that might need to happen in testing. That's what the test administration manuals are for. And we are going to focus on park and DC science. There will be forthcoming training opportunities and guidance on MSAA and ALT, but our focus here today is park and DC science. We are also focusing mostly on computer-based testing. Since it is a computer-based test, we will have some notes on paper-based testing, but do be aware that if you're administering paper-based tests to your students as accommodations, there might be some extra procedures outlined in the manual that we aren't going to cover explicitly today. But we are basing our schedule today on the questions we got most often last year and the things that we know people need to know in areas that you might get tripped up on. So we'll cover non-public organization setup in Pearson Access Next, student registration, Pearson Access Next user setup, accommodations in the PNP, scheduling and timing and training, Pearson Access Next creating test sessions, infrastructure trials, and final preparation. And that's all in the before testing section. One thing to note, if you're new to park, generally we find that the bulk of the work does happen before testing. It's in planning and preparation. When you get to during testing, it's really about executing the plan that you've already created. For more information, as we mentioned, all the materials from today, including this recording, are going to be posted on our website, and here's the link. We'll also send out slides to everyone who is registered for this webinar. Other links to note: park.pearson.com is our central hub for all things park. So practice tests, manuals, links to guidance, technology information, and more. There are also interactive training modules available via that website. And Park Support Center can help you individually via phone or live chat if you encounter issues, particularly technology issues. And their hours, phone number, and email are below. There's also a live chat available via Pearson Access Next that a lot of folks have found very helpful. Non-public organization setup. So this is something we wanted to address right off the bat because it is slightly unique, and it might be for those of you who serve, for instance, Maryland students, it might be slightly different from the way Maryland sets up their system. So we wanted to go over what it looks like for DC. So as we've mentioned, and as most of you know, many non-public sites serve DC students from multiple local education agencies. So you might have 5 students from DC public schools and a student from one charter school, a student from another charter school. So these in DC are all treated basically like separate school districts. And students from these different LEAs should be managed separately in the Pearson Access Next system. For an analogous way that data is set up, think about DC's SED system, our special education data system, where you have to go under each separate LEA that you might serve to find the student in SEDS. And the reason for both of those systems being set up that way is to keep sort of a firewall between data for different students, to make sure that the LEAs in question have some transparency into their own students' data for testing, for SEDS, and to allow LEA users to assist you in things like creating users and managing files. So the reason that non-public sites might have multiple schools set up under different LEAs, it's very important when you're managing students in the system to keep those students separate. So keep your DCPS students in your DCPS organization. If you're serving students for, from example, Friendship PCS, you keep them in the Friendship organization. KIP DC PCS, you keep them in the KIP organization. And I'm going to demonstrate what that looks like in the system. And some of you might already be familiar with this, since this is the same way we had it set up last year. So when you log into Pearson Access Next, you should see the school organizations in the drop-down at the upper right-hand side for each LEA you serve. And LEAs are differentiated by their codes. And also, we've incorporated LEA names into the non-public organizations this year. One thing to know, we had a question earlier about can you manage your Maryland and your DC students in Pearson Access Next at the same time? Both Maryland and DC students will be managed via Pearson Access Next, so it'll all be in the same system, but it'll be different sites. So DC's instance of Pearson Access Next is dc.pearsonaccessnext.com. Maryland's instance, I believe, is md.pearsonaccessnext.com, and they might have their organization set up slightly differently or have slightly different guidance for schools. So it'll be the same software, but you'll be looking at different websites, and it is very important, just the same way that you keep scores separate or keep students separate from different DC LEAs, definitely make sure you're keeping students from different states separate, because those scores go back to each respective state, and we don't want to get any Maryland scores, and that would be a problem in terms of both student privacy and making sure that student reports go to the right place. So here I have a screenshot of just what that might look like. So this is the Pearson Access Next training site, trng.pearsonaccessnext.com, which you all should have access to. And you'll see in the upper right-hand corner, I've set up a sample non-public school. And this sample non-public school, if you look at the drop-down, has two separate school organizations. There's sample non-public school serving DCPS, which we'll see right here, and the sample non-public school serving Friendship PCS right here. So you can differentiate if you are the test coordinator from sample non-public school. You should be administering and handling registrations for your DCPS students right here, and using the different organization to handle students coming from Friendship Public Charter School. And those are differentiated both by the names in the name of the organization and in the LEA code right here. So you'll see that the DCPS LEA code 1 is in that front part of the organization code, and the Friendship LEA code 120 is in the first part right there. And I'm going to quickly go over to the internet to show you live what that looks like. So here I am on the PARC Pearson Access Next training site. I'm going to sign in very quickly. First, check that you're in the 15-16 spring PARC. And here are my two sample non-public schools. So if you were a test coordinator for a non-public school, you would have access to multiple school organizations, and you should have access to an organization for each LEA that you serve. So if you serve 5 LEAs, you'll see 5 schools in this drop-down, and you would shift back and forth between them in order to manage those separate students. And if you go to your drop-down in the live site and you don't see all the LEAs you serve, contact that LEA to make sure that your user account has been given access to that school. You definitely want to make sure before testing that you have all your students in all their different LEAs set up appropriately in the system. So moving back to the PowerPoint here, sorry, just taking a moment to load. There we go. And I've just reiterated here in the slide that you should see a school organization for each LEA you serve, and that if you're missing an organization, you should contact the LEA for assistance in granting access. And just a reminder to keep students in their respective LEA organizations. Next, we'll move on to student registration. Initial registration for DC students in Park at dc.pearsonaccessnext.com is already complete. So you should be able to go in, assuming you have access to all your correct organizations, you should go in right now and see your students registered for Park already. If you have a student in grades 3 through 8 or one of those high school organizations who should be taking Park, they should be in Pearson Access Next. If they're taking the MSAA, that is managed on a separate system, so you wouldn't expect to see students who are alt eligible in the Park system. DC Science registrations for students in grades 5, 8, and biology will be coming later this spring, so don't expect to see anything science related in there quite yet. And it's the responsibility of schools and LEAs at this point to make sure that all student registrations are complete and up to date before the time of testing, including if you have any new students who come to your school, making sure that they're added, making sure that students are registered for the correct tests, and double-checking student data for correctness. For instance, a misspelled name could cause trouble down the line in matching up that student to the correct student record. So here I go through all the steps of adding a new student. We're not going to read through all of these, but this will be available to you to reference later on if you need to add a new student. Additionally, we go through the screenshots here of adding a new student. And registering a student for a test. Here's what the register student screen looks like, the manage student test screen, and selecting a student. I'm running through this quickly because I'm going to demo it for you live. And we'll pause there and go back to the training site on Pearson Access Next. So if I wanted to add a new student to my school one by one, in the training site in Pearson Access Next under Setup, I would go to Students. To show all the students who have been registered at my school, you click this blue down arrow here and select Show All Results. You'll see right now there aren't any students registered in Sample Nonpublic School. So if I wanted to create a new student, I would select Create Edit Students from the task list here, and all these other registration tasks, because after you add a student to the system, you then need to indicate which tests that they will be taking. Right now I'm going to switch back to a different sample school I have set up so I can show you a test registration that's already been created to walk you through those steps. So I'm going to choose this student who I've named after myself, but all this information is, of course, just for example purposes only. So here, after I've chosen my tasks, selected my student, and click Start, you go to this screen where you have a number of tabs across the top, which is how you manage the student tests. You'll see here in the Create Edit Student screen, it just has a very basic identifying information about the student. The state student identifier in DC, we call this the USI. In the tooltip here, it'll give you a little explanation if you hover over. And that just gives you a little bit of guidance. So you'll see for both DC and Maryland, this is a 10-digit number. So that's the 10-digit unique student identifier assigned by the state. Local student ID may or may not be assigned by your LEA, but it's not a required field, so generally don't worry about it unless your LEA would like you to use a local student ID so it can match up with their student data system down the line. Last and first name, birth date, sex, Park student identifier is another one you don't have to worry about. That will be automatically populated by the system. If the student took Park last year, then that will be populated so that it can match up their former test with their current test. Enroll students, it just shows the school where the student is enrolled. This registration screen is where you add some more student identifying and demographic information, such as race. The most important thing to fill in on this screen by far is whether or not this is a student with a disability and/or an English language learner. So for example purposes, since I know that constitutes most of the population we have in non-public schools in DC, I'm going to set this student as a student with an IEP. If you choose IEP, you also have to choose a primary disability type. For students from DC, this should already be populated, but if it's not for your student, make sure that it is. So we'll choose a disability type for this example student, and at the bottom of the page, we'll click Save. Finally, Manage Student Test is the part of the system where you're actually going to assign the student their grade level, math, and literacy. So if I wanted to assign a new test to the student, I would click Create Student Tests here and designate the student, the test, where he or she is testing, and down here is what we call the PNP, the Personal Needs Profile, and that's where you enter any special things about the student, but we'll go over that in detail later. One thing to note that is important in this first section is what the test format is for the student and whether it's a retest. For the vast majority of DC students, they won't be retesting unless they are, for instance, repeating geometry. It's not required for students from DC to take the test twice if they're repeating geometry, but that is an option available to you. If you want to manage multiple students at once, so it might be easier for you to manage, export all your DCPS students, export all your students from different schools. You can also manage multiple students at once by using the import-export data function. So how that works is first I'm going to exit from this task. Oops, sorry. I'm going to exit from this task, and under Import Export Data, if I wanted to do a file export of all the students in my school who are registered, I would select Import Export Data from the tasks, do Student Registration Export, File Layout Type CSV, and click Process. And it'll take a few moments. You can click this blue refresh button, but when your file's ready, it'll show up right here. You can repeat the same process with the student registration import in order to import any changes you might make. And we explain that here. If there are any errors in the record you import, the system will show you an error report, which you can download. And here, again, is just what the screen looks like. There will be a blue download link when your file export is complete. Again, just a reminder, if you're managing files at a non-public school, be sure you're keeping those files separate for students from different LEAs. One new thing this year is that we do have a required naming convention for test sessions in DC. So test sessions are the testing groups that you place students in to administer a computer-based test. And so actually, for both computer and paper-based tests, we are asking that all schools populate in their student registration file the last name and first name of the test administrator who will be giving the test to the student, and this naming convention to name the session using subject, grade, test administrator initials, and whether it's a regular or a makeup test session. And if you upload a student registration file using the method I just showed you with the student session name populated, it will auto-create a test session for you. And test sessions are something that we will go into further detail on a little bit later. Some LEAs may have additional requirements or guidance for their non-public schools to enter in any additional data in the system, but this is what the state requires in addition to what's required to just assign a test to a student. Here are some common errors when importing data files. We get a lot of emails about this one. The main thing is the files are very particular about what they'll accept, what the system will accept as an upload. So if you want to avoid errors, as you'll see here, the main things we see as causes of errors in a file import is the length of the LEA and school ID, the format of the birth date, and the grade. So this can be something you come back to later when you're looking at the PowerPoint, just to see if you're getting an error. This might be one of the causes. And file templates and guidance for every single upload you can do of a different file format are all available in Pearson Access Next under the Support tab. And the Pearson Park support staff can also walk you through any file you're trying to import. So I'm just going to pause here for a moment to take a look at any questions that we've received. I know that Pearson Access Next does take a lot of work and time, so I want to make sure that we are taking a look at your questions as we go along. We did receive a question about receiving login information for Pearson Access Next. That's something I'll cover in the next section. Yes, to my point earlier about 4-digit LEA and school names, most LEAs in DC have a 3-digit ID number, as do most schools actually, though not most non-public schools. So yes, there should be a leading 0 in the file in order for it to import properly, and that's just a convention from the Pearson file. One thing to note, if your students are not in Pearson Access Next yet, communicate with your LEA to make sure that they're not seeing them either and that maybe they're in the wrong place in the system. But if you're not seeing them, you can add them yourself. So it is the responsibility of schools and districts to manage students. So if you're seeing missing students, you can add them yourselves. And please do that. All right, so I'm getting a lot of questions about user IDs and access, which is great because that is the next item on our agenda, as you can see from the slide. So we'll go right into that. So as most of you know, any authorized personnel in your school who need to use Pearson Access Next will need user accounts created for them in the DC site. Also, if you want to use the training site that I showed earlier, and we do recommend that folks use that, they'll also need access to the training site. Each user account may have different permissions assigned based on their role and the needs of that user. For instance, as a state user, I have a lot of permissions. A regular test administrator who might only be working with a small group of students won't really need to get into the student data and the registrations and the technical side. They'll really just need the access to administer the test to their students. User accounts from last year are still in the system and may be reactivated as appropriate. And user accounts can be managed individually or using the file import and export feature. So if you are a user from a non-public and you don't have access, I would follow up either if you're not the school test coordinator for the non-public, follow up with your school test coordinator. Or follow up with your LEA coordinator to make sure that they reactivate your account for their LEA. So it might be that your school is set up in the system, but no one has reactivated your account yet. So follow up with your point person at the LEAs, so either DCPS or the charter LEAs, to make sure that they reactivate your accounts as well. I have been hearing communications from different LEA test coordinators about reactivating their non-public users' accounts. So know that that's something we've communicated to them as well, their responsibility to reactivate your account. So if you don't have access in your school test coordinator at a non-public site, follow up with your LEA or LEAs, as the case may be. Then once one person at the site has access, they can grant access to all the other staff members. So if you have a colleague who has already been given access, you don't have to wait for the LEA to give you access for other staff members. You can manage that yourself within your buildings, and I can show you how to do that. One note on user account permissions, they are up to each LEA in school. We don't always know what roles people might have, what responsibilities they might have, but generally you want to provide the minimum access necessary for that person to fulfill their role. So for instance, if a person is just a test administrator, they should really only have the test administrator role. But there is a whole variety of roles and account permissions, and there is a user role matrix on Pearson Access Next that can guide you in selecting which roles are appropriate for which staff members. And this is just a screenshot of where you can find the user file sample layout, user file field definitions, and the user role matrix. So here's the step-by-step to how to create a new account. And as before, I'm going to demo it for you. And please do take note of this because this is something we get a lot of questions about. But it's really going to be easier and more timely if you have someone in your building whose account has been reactivated, that they do that for their other colleagues. And here again is how you reactivate an old account. If you are looking up a colleague's account in your building, you would search for that person, and then under Create Edit Users, you would delete the active end date from their account and click Save. And again, I'm going to demo this live. One note before we switch back to the site, many non-public users are going to have accounts with access to multiple organizations if they're working with students from multiple LEAs, and I'm going to demo what I mean by that. So here is an example. If this user here with our example email address needs access to students at Sample Nonpublic School from both DCPS and Friendship, they're going to have two organizations listed here. And you'll also see that this person has multiple user roles. So they're a school test coordinator, and they also have the sensitive data role, which allows them to edit student data. And they have the ability to request an additional paper order. These are actually the roles that we recommend giving for folks who are working across the school level. So moving back to the site, you'll see under Setup and Users, if I wanted to create a new user, I'm going to actually switch back to my state level role so I can show you what it looks like to assign a user with access to multiple schools. So I'm going to choose Create Edit Users and Reset Passwords. So if you were looking for a user that already existed in the system, you could search them by last name here. You could show all results here. And you can also look by account status, see if their account had been deleted or disabled. But in general, we just have that active end date on folks. So if I wanted to create a new user with access to both school organizations for my Sample Nonpublic School, I would put both organizations here in the Sample Nonpublic School site. For selected roles, let's say this person is a test administrator. I would put test administrator in the roles here. The account's enabled, and I would put their first name, their last name, their email address here. You can leave active begin date and end date blank, or if you'd like to set it up so that automatically access is disabled at the end of the testing period, which might be appropriate for a test administrator, you can put, for instance, 5/20, which is the last day of testing in DC. And you'll see if you try to save without an email, of course it won't work. But that in general is how you would create a user with access to multiple organizations. So that is something to remember as you're creating users for your colleagues, to have make sure that you're giving them access to each student they'd need. And if you'd like to manage that via the import-export function, again, you'd go to Setup, Import-Export Data, choose Import-Export Data from the tasks, and do a user export instead of a student export. And that's going to export all the users in the system, even the disabled ones. So you can see if there are people in your building who need access. You can use that to manage them all at once. And again, under the Support tab here and Documentation, you'll find file formats and instructions for every file that you might need to import or export. So a couple things to remember with users, especially for non-public schools. So not only would you have separate accounts for the training site and the dc.pearsonaccessnext site, you might also need to manage accounts for the md.pearsonaccessnext site if you serve Maryland students, and to make sure that if you're resetting passwords or giving people access, that you're doing it for all the school organizations that they need. And if no one in your building has access yet, follow up with your LEA contacts to be granted access. It might be that they just have not successfully unlocked your access yet. And if you don't have luck with that, you can also follow up with us, but it's best to follow up with your LEA test coordinator. Okay, we're going to take a brief pause here, and I'm going to take a look again at the questions pane for any questions on what we just covered with users. Just to reiterate, we do have a question about who is our LEA coordinator for non-publics. It really depends on what students you enroll. So the most common, the biggest LEA in DC is DCPS. You can follow up with them at dcps.testing if you enroll students from DC public schools. If you serve students from charter schools, you would need to follow up with them separately. So I would say for many non-publics, they would need to reach out to dcps.testing@dc.gov as their LEA contact, but you may also need to reach out to your contacts at the separate charter organizations that you might serve. So I can't say for sure for every non-public who your LEA contacts are, because it really depends on what students you serve. Yes, so if you get an error message when you try to log in to Pearson Access Next, it's probably because your user account from last year has been temporarily disabled and needs an LEA person to unlock for you. So do follow up. If you serve students from DCPS, that would be dcps.testing. If you serve students from charter schools, it would be the respective charters. Though, as I said before, if you do have a colleague in your building who has already had their account unlocked, they can also unlock your account for you. So there's multiple avenues. All right, and with that, we're going to switch presenters to my colleague Lanisha Adams, who is our assessment specialist focused on special populations, so focused on MSIA and ALT, focused on English learners and students with disabilities. Lanisha, are you on the line?
I am. Thank you so much for the introduction, Bonnie. Can everyone hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay, great. Going on to the next slide. With this slide, what I've tried to do is show you a snapshot of what we mean by the term special population. Special population is a legal one that covers a wide range of communities, but here at OSSE we use it to refer to 4 distinct groups of students who may receive accommodations on statewide assessments. Accommodations are intended to reduce the effects of a student's disability and/or English language proficiency level, but not to reduce learning expectations. So the first group of students who may receive accommodation include students with disabilities who have an individualized education program. The second group includes students with the Section 504 plan. The third group includes students who are English learners, and the fourth group includes students who are English learners and who are students with disabilities who have an IEP or a 504 plan. These students are eligible for both accommodations for students with disabilities and English learners. Going on to the next slide, as you know, we have 3 content-specific statewide assessments. One is for science, and the other 2 are PARC summative assessments for math and English language arts and literacy. When taking a closer look at the PARC assessments, it's helpful to understand how accommodations are divvied up. If there is a student who needs to have a certain accessibility feature available to them because of their disability, legally this is called an accommodation. These accommodations are listed in an IEP or 504 plan that must be provided to students. I start with this point simply to distinguish between PARC's accessibility features and accommodation features. So as you'll see in the bullets here, accessibility features built into the system increase access to the test content for all students and can be accessed at any time. PARC has 2 kinds of accommodations in the blue circle here. That they call accessibility features. Some are built into the tests and automatically are available at any time. For example, a highlighter tool. Other features are a little more technologically advanced and have to be activated in the system ahead of time. Or it might be an administrative consideration, which I'll go over these examples on the next slide. And lastly, PARC calls the third group of these actual accommodations in the green circle because they do not make them available to all students. They are only available for students with disabilities or English learners. To drive home the point, if a student with a disability qualifies for one of these accessibility features, that means that they have a legal right to it across all assessments, and so on the IEP itself and in SEDS, it is going to be documented as an accommodation. Generally, as you all know, there are 4 types of accommodations related to setting, timing and scheduling, presentation, and response. So let's look at a couple of examples of these different categories according to PARC. With these accessibility features for all students, examples include pop-up glossary, line reader tool, or highlighters and enlarged font. Here are a few more accommodations that PARC calls accessibility features. Text-to-speech for math assessment, color contrast. And then there are these accommodations that are more of an administrative type, where it's not something that's built into the PARC test, but it's something that the school builds into their test plan to make sure a student can get a break or have small group testing if that's what they need. Nikki Stewart is going to be talking in detail about these administrative considerations later in our webinar today. Lastly, here are some third examples of accommodations that are only for students with disabilities, such as a special calculation device or Braille test booklets. And lastly, for English learners, there are accommodations such as a published word-to-word dictionary that does not include definitions, phrases, sentences, or pictures, or translation of PARC math to Spanish. What you see here is not an entire list. These are just some examples to help you understand the different categories according to the way that the PARC assessment divides them up. Stay on this slide, Bonnie. To recap, there are 3 buckets that need to be attended to for accommodations. So the first is what we call accessibility features for all students. That's in purple, and these features are embedded in the PARC online delivery platform or Pearson Access Next. The second bucket in blue relates to accessibility features that must be identified in advance as indicated in the student's personal needs profile, or the PNP. And the third bucket in green relates to supports only for students with disability, English learners, and or English learners with disabilities. Moving on to the next slide, I want to call attention to the three-part series of webinars focused on accommodations that we're offering at OSSE. These have already happened, and you can access them by clicking on the hyperlink here. Once you have the PowerPoint, you'll be able to click the hyperlink and go to a recording of the webinar and listen to and follow along and download the slides associated with the webinar. Moving on to the next slide. An additional resource that you might find helpful is the crosswalk between SEDS and the 3 content-specific statewide assessments. So each DC statewide assessment has its own guidelines for test administration. The implementation of each accommodation may vary from assessment to assessment, and where there are differences, students eligible to receive accommodations must receive an equivalent across the different test platforms. So this crosswalk is a good resource for comparing accommodations available for selection in SEDS, seeing what is available as a classroom accommodation versus a statewide testing accommodation, and it's also good for looking at an accommodation equivalent across SEDS and the content-specific statewide assessments. So you can see additional resources at each of these websites. At park.pearson.com, there are practice tutorials, as Bonnie mentioned earlier. As you know, when implementing an accommodation, it is very important that students are familiar with the accommodation before testing. Accommodations should never be used for the first time on a state assessment. Here is where you'd access practice tutorials to familiarize yourself and students with the kinds of accessibility features and accommodations in Pearson Access Next. We're talking about it at a very high level, but here on these sites you can go and play around with it and see how it functions appropriately. And additionally, there is a very in-depth accommodations manual that specifies implementation guidance before, during, and after testing. In Part 1 and Part 2 of our testing accommodations manual for school year 15-16, we've distilled the main points detailing what the accommodations manual comparing across all statewide assessments in a way that is similar to the crosswalk, but we have hyperlinks to this more in-depth park manual. There are also training modules and a number of other resources on these sites. The Park Personal Needs Profile, or PNP, records the accessibility features and accommodations for every student and turns on computer-based accommodations. It both documents the accommodations that students received, and for computer-based tests, make sure that those features are turned on and available for the student. Something new this year that's different from last year is that the student registration file and PNP are combined into one file. Accommodations must be entered into the Pearson Access Next system on the student's PNP, and there's no deadline for this. I would highly recommend starting as soon as possible. It's the responsibility of you all to keep registrations up to date and to add any necessary accommodations and accessibility features. So if needed, the PNP can be edited right up until the assessment information is downloaded. Next, Bonnie is going to show you, next slide, Bonnie. Documenting accommodations in Pearson Access Next is required, even if the accommodation isn't linked to the computer. Computer accommodations must be entered for students prior to proctor caching the test. The ELA read aloud and ELA text-to-speech are allowable accommodations, but are only appropriate for a very small number of students. Please use Appendix D guidance when assigning read aloud and text-to-speech accommodations for ELA and literacy. This Appendix D is available from the Avocet website, and you'll see the link there. I want to say a little bit about the read aloud accommodation for English language arts and literacy. This accommodation is intended to provide access to printed or written text to a small number of students with print-related disabilities who would otherwise be unable to participate in the assessment because their disability severely limits or prevents their abilities to access printed text by decoding. It's not intended for students reading somewhat moderately below grade level. For example, if a student with dyslexia had read aloud for ELA literacy assessments marked in SEDS and met the criteria outlined in Appendix D, then they would qualify for the text-to-speech or read aloud accommodation for PARCC, ELA, and literacy. The read aloud accommodation is one that must be assigned with strict scrutiny to determine if the student actually needs it. Since a change in administration conditions is only considered an accommodation if it does not change what is being measured, reading a test item or passage aloud on an English language arts literacy test is controversial, which is why I'm spending a lot of airtime talking about it. Decoding is often considered a necessary component of reading comprehension, and discerning whether the student has a disability that severely limits or prevents him or her from decoding text is a difficult one that the IEP team or 504 coordinator must undergo. So please use the Appendix D guidance that's outlined on Avocet, and really think about if the student actually needs this accommodation for read aloud for the ELA and literacy portion of the PARCC assessment. If an accommodation is needed for a student that is not listed in SEDS under one of the 4 categories of setting, timing and scheduling, presentation, and response, then the IEP team should document it on the IEP in the unique accommodations box in SEDS. I'm going to show you a screenshot here, there it is, of what that should look like. Additionally, the LEA, you all must submit a unique accommodations request to OSSE for approval. Please do not send this any personally identifiable information via email per FERPA laws. One thing I do want to note is that if you have students who are at DCPS, they have a deadline that's coming up for March 10th for these unique accommodations. Of course, if there are new students coming to your school after that deadline, we will consider unique accommodations requests. But if you know what those unique accommodations are now, please contact me, and I will, or contact your LEA, contact DCPS, your contacts there, to make sure that you know what is required to apply for this request for unique accommodations. Because if you have students, and this is only for if you have students who are attending where your LEA is DCPS, the deadline for unique accommodations is March 10th. If you're at a charter or some other LEA that's not DCPS, the deadline is ongoing. So please follow up with your LEA if you have students who are at DCPS. And I think that concludes the slides that I have to discuss in this section. I'm going to turn it back over to Bonnie.
Thanks, Lanisha. And I think we're going to do a quick demo now of some of the PMP information that Lanisha was referring to. So I showed you earlier the part of the student record that we call the PMP, but I do want to show you, how the accommodations are set up there, since we do have a lot of you serving students with disabilities. So again, I'm going to go to Setup and Students. I'm going to search for the student that I'm looking for, the same student I was looking at before. And I'm going to go to Manage Student Tests under Tasks, which is where you'll mark items for the PNP. So it is required to document any accommodations that students are being given. That's a federal requirement. We do have to report that. And it's important to document that you are implementing the requirements of the student's IEP. So this is really how you show and document that you are educating and assessing according to the IEP, which, as we all know, is very important. So I'm going to go to the student's ELA literacy tests. You'll notice that the tests are managed separately. So you will have to fill out the PMP for each test. And that's simply because what might be required for one test might not be appropriate for another. There's no need for a calculator accommodation for an ELA test, for example. So here you'll see they're broken up into different sections. So if this student, for instance, needed to be part of a small testing group, I would mark that here. And that's an example of an accommodation/accessibility feature. So if this was on the student's IEP that she needed one-on-one testing, small group testing, I would mark that here. So one-on-one testing is, considered a small group testing under PARC. But if it wasn't on the student's IEP, but I think it would be helpful, I could just do it. And that's what makes it an accessibility feature. So for some students, it's required if it's on their IEP, but it is available to all students if it's something that you think would be helpful in terms of testing experience and classroom management. So if we move down here under presentation accommodations, one thing some of you might note, if the student has on their IEP that they need a paper representation of the test. So the default for DC students is to go online, but if the student needs a paper representation of the test because of their disability, you would choose alternate representation paper test here, and you would also make sure that up at the top, remember I had marked online, you would make sure to mark paper. And that's just so when you send the booklet back, it's going to match up correctly with the student's record here. On the other side of the coin, sort of the opposite of paper representation, is a special online version of the test. So one example of that is ASL video. And if you scroll over each accommodation or accessibility feature here, there is a brief description that pops up. So that's also very helpful. So you can get a little translation of what each of these means. But ASL video is basically the sign language version of a read aloud. So if you have a student who uses ASL to communicate and they also need a read aloud, this provides a video of an ASL signer signing the content of the test, pops up right next to the test. It's actually a really cool feature, but that's obviously a special version of the test, so you need to make sure that that's marked ahead of time so the student gets that special version of the test. Response accommodations, you'll see it varies according to tests, so mathematical response, ELA constructed response versus selected response. So for instance, maybe a student needs a scribe for the writing section, but for selected response multiple choice questions, they can handle it themselves. So you can differentiate that way. We did get a question earlier about, can a test administrator serve as a scribe for the student in a small group session? Yes. That would be appropriate. Just make sure that the test administrator is trained as a scribe and that they know all their roles. So test administrators who will be providing accommodations to students may need special training for the specific accommodation that you're asking them to provide. You could also have a proctor in the room so that you'd have a test administrator serving as the lead and then a proctor serving as the scribe. That's also an option available to you. And so then you just go down and mark any appropriate accommodations and accessibility features and click Save. And again, the PNP, like student registration, is something that can be managed in bulk as well via the import-export data function. So we're going to take a quick moment to look at the questions here we might have gotten on accommodations. We did get a question, can the read aloud accommodation be read by a human reader or does it have to be done by computer? So this is actually something we addressed most recently on our accommodations webinar on Monday, but the answer is you can do both. So there are several options if a student has a read aloud accommodation. One is that the student gets the text-to-speech on the computer-based test. Another is that the student has a human reader for the computer-based test, and I'm going to show you how to set that up. Or the third is that if the student also has an accommodation for a paper-based test, they You do a paper-based test with a human reader reading from a paper test booklet. So those are all options available depending on the needs of your student. So this section here on scheduling and timing, I'm going to go through fairly quickly, but it is going to be available to you in the slides to refer back to later. As I mentioned, these are the test windows. There are 3 options for computer, 1 option for paper, and an overarching big option for DC Science. So we don't expect, even within these options, that you would necessarily use every day for testing, but that is available to you. Specifically for non-public schools, you might be in a situation where most schools in DC are in option 3, this 411 to 520 option. That's where DC Public Schools has chosen for their test window. That's actually where we have most of our LEAs for their test window. But you might be serving a student from an LEA with an earlier test window, or you might be serving a student from an LEA doing paper and some serving an LEA doing computer. In this instance, it's most important that at the school level, you do no more than 30 school days of testing. So just make sure if you are serving 2 LEAs with different test windows, that you choose one test window and communicate to any other LEA. So for instance, if you're serving a student from LEA A, that's chosen option 1, but then you've got 10 students from LEA B that has option 3, you probably would choose to test in the option 3 window. You just need to communicate to LEA A that you'll be doing a slightly different test window for XYZ reasons. So they know to expect their test plan from you at a different date, expect the affidavits at a different date that is available. For the most part, you should be testing students in your building in one of these windows. So as I say below, if non-publics are testing in a different window from their LEAs, this should be documented in the school test plan that you submit to the LEA, so they're aware of the dates on which you're testing. The ELA test units, each unit is differently timed, which certainly makes scheduling a challenge. Another thing that makes scheduling a challenge is the fact that you might be dealing with a lot of small group testers, accommodations that need to be grouped separately. We kind of approach this as the puzzle of scheduling. And here are all the math test units as well. One thing to note that might be slightly different on ELA test units from your students in Maryland is that all DC students in 4th and 7th grade should be taking the ELA field test. So you'll notice here that 4th and 7th graders have Unit 3A and 3B. We have a couple questions here. Can students from DCPS test in the same test session as a different LEA, and can students from different states test in the same test session? So those students can test in the same room as one another. Physically, in your school, you can certainly test your students from Maryland, DC, different LEAs in the same room as one another with the same test administrator, assuming that they're all taking the same test, same unit, all that. You can certainly do that. The only wrinkle in that is that you'll be managing on the back end in Pearson Nexus Next. Those students will appear in different test sessions in Pearson Nexus Next because you can't place students from DC and Maryland in the same test session in PA Next, even if they're in the same room in front of you. And in the during testing section, we'll cover this a little bit. Basically, you would just need to have different tabs open in your computer looking at the different sessions at the same time, even if the students are in the same room. We also have another question about scheduling. Can students from different grades test in the same room together and different units? So generally, I think in terms of setting up your test schedule, the strong preference is to have students from the same grade, 1 room per grade, 1 unit per grade. It just makes things a lot less complicated. But as we'll address a little later down the road with makeup test sessions, we understand that there might be some scenarios depending on your space, your students. If you're a non-public school with 3 students, maybe it doesn't make, in different grades from DC, maybe it doesn't make sense to test them all separately. Just make sure if you're testing students from different grades in the same room, A, it's documented on your test plan, and B, pay special attention to the unit times. Which this year are mostly sort of blocked by grade block. So you'll notice in the math test times, which I'm showing on the screen right now, all the math units for grades 6 through 8 are all 80 minutes, and all the units for grades 3 through 5 are 60 minutes. So that's usually not a problem. And generally the directions for the test are also by grade band, but just make sure if you're mixing students from different grades together, which is an option, just maybe not recommended as your default, that you pay special attention to the timing and the test directions to make sure that each student gets the time to which they're entitled. Training authorized personnel. We're not going to spend much time on this today, but I wanted to make you aware, as Jessica talked about earlier, training authorized personnel is a school responsibility. And anyone who's authorized personnel, test administrators, proctors, will need to receive school-based training. Training should be documented and placed in your security file. We recommend a sign-in sheet for training and a copy of any training materials you gave out to your people, and also a roster that they've all received the test integrity and security notification statement. I want to show you on our website, we do have a template that you can use as sort of an outline to design your own training. So we're here at aussie.dc.gov on the assessments site, and down here you'll see a link to test coordinator training. So here we have the PowerPoint from the trainings we gave earlier to all schools. This is the site where this recording, as well as the PowerPoint specifically for non-public schools, will be placed. And you'll see right here, sample test security training for schools. So this is an optional sample slide deck schools may use as a template. So I encourage you all to go to our website at aussie.dc.gov to the test coordinator training page and download the sample test security training. All right, I'm going to take a quick moment before we move on to creating and editing test sessions. One last question about scheduling we've just got in. Is there a required test administrator to student ratio? Generally, no.
I don't see any matching places. Sorry about that.
Our recommended ratio is probably about 15:1 for a test administrator without a proctor, 25:1. I really wouldn't make a ratio that's bigger than your normal class size, so whatever that is. For computer-based testing, it is generally a good idea to have proctors if you have enough people to do so. Proctors don't have to be school staff. They can also be volunteers, but parents of students in that room should never be in that testing session. But you can use your volunteers or school aides as proctors, simply because with computer-based testing, if you encounter technical issues or behavioral issues, it might be a lot easier to have a second adult in the room to help with classroom management and go get help if help is needed. And proctors, just like test administrators, do need to be trained as to their role. They might not need quite as much training, but they do need to know the security requirements for being involved in testing and know how to assist the test administrator in whatever you'd like them to do. So whether that's the communication plan for your school, things like that. Once again, just getting a quick follow-up question on that. The way you would find our sample test security training is right here, aussie.dc.gov/page/test coordinators training. And you can get to that via our state assessment site. So under programs, assessment and accountability assessments, and test coordinator training is under that. And again, we will email out this slide deck with all accompanying links to everyone who's registered for this training today. Creating and editing test sessions. So this is something that we talked about a little bit earlier. Test sessions are groups of students within Pearson Access Next, and before students take the test for computer-based testing, they must be placed in a test session for each test that they're taking: math, ELA, DC Science. Test sessions should generally match testing groups, but for non-publics, as we talked about a little earlier, students from different LEAs or different states cannot be in the same test session in the system, but they may test in the same room. Similarly, if you're testing multiple grades at the same time, students from different grades can't be in the same session in the system, but they may be testing in the same room, as long as this is documented on your test plan. So we do have naming requirements for how you name your test sessions. That was covered a little bit earlier in the training, and it's also in our school plan guidance. And if you upload students with their test session name populated in their student registration file, Pearson Access Next will auto-create the test sessions for you. And there's a PA Next training module that demonstrates most of what I'm about to show you. So here are all the step-by-step instructions for creating and editing a test session. Everything I've shown you up to this point has been under the Setup page in Pearson Access Next. Note that sessions are under the Testing page. And note that you can add students to sessions individually by name or in bulk. And this is what the session screen looks like. So if I go back here and go back to Pearson Access Next, back to the training site homepage, under Testing and Sessions, again, you can see all the sessions that have been created by doing the little blue button. You'll see here actually some of these sessions have already been started because we do have schools in DC doing infrastructure trials. So I'm going to choose my sample sessions here, and under Create Edit Sessions, you'll see I have the name, the test date, the computer where pre-caching will occur, and that is a technical piece of preparation that we're not going to cover in this training, but that will be covered this Monday in a training for technology coordinators that will also be recorded and posted to our website. And you'll see we have one student placed in this session, which is for grade 8 ELA literacy. As to the question earlier about read aloud for, can you do, for instance, a computer test with a human reader? Yes. And how you would do that is when you're setting up the session, choose Proctor Reads Aloud. It's not letting me choose it right now because the session's already been started. But if you were setting up the session, you would choose Proctor Reads Aloud when you set up the session. And what that's going to do for you, if you have a small group of students all getting a human reader on a computer-based test, that'll make sure that those, say, 3 students who are in the room all get assigned the same test form, and that when you go to print out the student testing tickets, the proctor will also get their own testing ticket. So he'll also generate a proctor test administrator testing ticket. And so that way the proctor can have their own computer and their own version of the test where no answers will be saved, obviously, so that they don't have to be leaning over students' computers or anything like that. So that is a great feature. But if you have students with text-to-speech, that's not necessary. And students with the text-to-speech version of Read Aloud can be sitting and testing in the same room as their classmates. I just mentioned infrastructure trials. We do have several schools in DC doing their infrastructure trials this week, and especially for any schools here that are new to computer-based testing this year, or if just the folks in your school are new to computer-based testing, this is something we strongly, strongly recommend. Infrastructure trials are basically a dress rehearsal of the test, logistically and technologically. And you can involve both students, teachers, and school staff to prepare for a live testing experience. And this is a great chance to sort of pressure test your systems, practice your communications internally, make sure that your devices are set up correctly. And there's a detailed guide available on Avocet, which is the document hub for all things Park and Pearson. So it's a step-by-step guide. Basically, you are administering a dress rehearsal test. Instead of using dc.pearsonexus.com, you're using the training site that I've been showing you, the brown site, trng.pearsonexusnext.com. Setting up sample students or importing a version of your student file, and allowing students to take a practice test, which will be, multiple units. It'll really mimic the live testing experience. So that's something we do strongly recommend. One thing new this year in infrastructure trials that may be of particular interest to the folks on this training is that the P&P in the infrastructure trial now works. And so last year, infrastructure trials, if you marked student P&P accommodations information, it wouldn't really change anything about the practice test they received. Now you can use the P&P in the infrastructure trial to assign students a version of the practice test or a tutorial of the accommodations they'll get. So if you have students who need text-to-speech for math, you can assign them a version of that tutorial to familiarize them with what it will look like during live testing. So that's new and something we're excited about. And a few final steps before testing to cover, and we are right on time for this webinar, which is exciting. We still have an hour left to go, but I'm still hoping that we can get you all out early. So before testing, a couple other items not to forget. First, check before testing begins that all your students are registered and all their P&P information is complete and correct before proctor caching, which means downloading an encrypted version of the test that students will draw from. Set up your computers in your proctor cache. That'll be covered in our Technology Coordinators webinar on Monday. Gather any ancillary materials for distribution. So you're going to want blank paper, pencils, headphones are required for the ELA assessment or for any student doing text-to-speech. Maybe you want to gather up any handheld calculators for students with a calculator accommodation. And in your test coordinator manual, there are lists of required and optional materials. You're going to want to print and secure student testing tickets. For computer-based testing, those testing tickets are considered a secure document, and once you print them and create them, they'll need to be tracked and kept in a locked, secure place. They can't just be, left out on a desk. So treat those student testing tickets the same way you would a booklet of test questions. And place an order for any additional paper materials you'll need at least 5 business days before they're needed. And meet with students and notify parents of testing. One thing to note here on the paper materials order, the window for ordering additional paper materials opens on March 9th, so in about a week. The order window will open. And so then on Pearson Access Next under Setup, you'll see Orders and Tracking. Orders and shipment tracking, and you can use that to place any order for paper tests that you might need. So most students have not had paper tests ordered for them already, so if you need a Braille test, a paper read aloud kit, you can order all that via Pearson Access Next. But make sure you do so with plenty of time because it's going to take at least 5 business days to get that shipped to you. So basically your last step before testing is going to be printing these student testing tickets. So under Testing and Students in Sessions, choose the session you want from the list on the left side of the screen. And then under the Download Resources dropdown, choose the view you want for tickets to download. So I'll show you how to get to that right now. So under Testing, I'm going to go to Sessions. And you'll remember from before, I've got these 2 sessions selected, my sample sessions. And here I can either click right here, Go to Students in Session, or I can get to Students in Sessions from the menu. So this is sort of the live testing view, and you can look at multiple sessions at once or one at a time. And what I'm going to want to do, if I were just starting here or getting ready to test tomorrow, under Download Resources, I would choose the kind of testing tickets I wanted to download. So you can download them 4 to a page, good for the environment, or in a grid or list view. So actually, if you were managing students from DC and Maryland and a couple different DC LEAs, you would need to have those sessions managed separately, probably in separate tabs open on your computer, because you can only really be signed into one organization at a time in this site. So if I were a non-public test coordinator, I might want to open another window and sign in. Got my sample non-public school DCPS here. So I might want to be signed in to multiple organizations in different tabs, and that's a good tip for you. And then once you download the student testing ticket, this is what it's going to look like. And this is, of course, just a sample. So it's going to have the student name, their date of birth, the name of the test. So a student will have 1 ticket for ELA, 1 for math, 1 for science. And just some directions on how to get to the test. And the username and password for that particular student. This optional line down at the bottom, if you encounter any technical difficulties on the test, it's good practice to know what computer the student was using when they encountered those difficulties, because it's possible that you'll need to retrieve a student log file from that computer if something goes wrong. So now we're going to move on to during testing. Before we do so, I'll take a quick moment to read any questions you all have sent in on the before testing section. All right, the only question we have right now is related to this, is how far in advance can I download student testing tickets? Technically speaking, you can download them as soon as you set up the test session, but since they constitute secure materials and need to be tracked, we really don't recommend downloading them until maybe 48 hours, 24 hours before the test starts. Also, that way, if you need to change anything about the student test last minute, if you need to add any students, or if you discover that there's something that needs to be added to the PMP last minute, that might require you to generate a new testing ticket. So it's generally good to kind of wait to the last minute with the testing tickets, just because if you change something for the student, you might need to then generate a new testing ticket, and we don't want to duplicate work. So moving on to our during testing session. So as I mentioned before, for PARC, for DC Science, the bulk of your work is going to be planning, setting up these communications, training folks, getting everything ready to go. When you get to during testing, you really should just be executing your security plan, executing your logistics plan, and referring back to the manual and referring back to PARC and Pearson if you run into any trouble. So we're going to go straight into managing computer test sessions during testing, but I do want to give a shout out. In the longer version of this training, we did cover some recommended best practices that are really good to think about. And if you'd like to take a look at those slides, and I encourage you to do so, if we go back to our school test coordinator training site here, we have the long version of the PowerPoint. 2016 School Test Coordinator Training PowerPoint, and that has all of the sort of best practices recommendations. Things like, I know certain schools will print out tickets for students from different grades on different colors of paper so that it can be visually easily identified. And maybe for a non-public environment, that might mean printing out the Maryland student test tickets in pink and the DC student test tickets in green so that you can easily identify who belongs where. So things like that, things like taking into account breaks and what's going on in your building. You want to make sure that everyone in your building, even those not involved in testing, know their role and their expectations. You're not going to want little kids and kindergartners running out to the playground right underneath the window of the place where you're trying to maintain a quiet test environment. So consider how your schedule will interact and what your non-tested students are doing during testing, so they're not running through the hallways having a good time while you've got students testing. But we're going to go right into the nitty-gritty of managing computer test sessions during testing. As I just showed you, under testing and students in session, you would choose the sessions from the list that you want to see, and you can also view a combined view of sessions, though this is only within that particular testing organization. And from students from different LEAs or different states, you can manage their sessions in separate tabs. One thing that's new this year is this year each unit of every PARCC test is set up separately and can be locked and unlocked by a test administrator, a test coordinator from the students in session screen. So this means no more seal codes. Seal codes are no longer required for PARCC testing. This also means if students need to test out of order for makeup testing, you no longer need to do the whole set section start thing if this was something you did last year. So lock and unlocking student test units can be done at the student level or for everybody in the session at once. Another new thing this year is that the test form ID will easily confirm for students getting accommodated computer tests if the student has been assigned that test before they start. So if you're giving a text-to-speech, you'll see in the test form ID, TTS. So this is what the students in session screen looks like before testing starts. So this sample test session is gray here. You saw it was green earlier. That just means it hasn't been started yet. And you'll see down at the bottom right side of the screen, you have this sample student in a sample session, and each unit is separate, which is new this year. And we'll just note that is the name of the session right there on the left, where we're pointing with the arrow. There's the start button, which you would press right before testing begins. And down here is the units, and you'll see that those units are locked right now. So a unit would need to be unlocked by the test administrator or test coordinator before the student could actually successfully sign in and test. The system is set up such that only one unit can be locked at a time, or unlocked at a time rather. So this is really important. I know last year we sometimes had struggles with seal codes and students accidentally moving forward in the test when they didn't mean to. So this lock-unlock functionality will hopefully solve all that. When students are testing, their units will show their test status. So you'll see in the bottom right, it says ready when students haven't yet started the test. When they're actively logged in, it will say active. And then when they're done with the unit, it will say completed. And we have all the session, all the statuses listed out here. So I'm going to go back very quickly to our students in session screen to show you what it looks like in a sort of live testing environment. So this sample test unit has already been started, and you'll see right now all our units are locked. Since this unit is completed and in blue, you'll see blue means marked complete or complete. It's locked. So a completed unit can't be gotten back into. But if I wanted to proceed for Unit 3 for this student who's in the session, or multiple students in the session, right now I just have one student in the session, but you could have many, I would click Unlock right here. And now this student is able to sign in to her Unit 3. And you'll see it says Ready now without the lock icon next to it, but her complete units in blue are locked and can't be unlocked to get back into. So she is ready to start testing. But if I unlock this in the morning and come 10 a.m. I discover that the student is absent, I can lock it back up again, especially since she hasn't yet signed into the test. So that is just in multiple ways going to make your life a little easier. It's going to be easier to track which students need makeup tests because you can see at a glance what units have been completed and which haven't. And if you have a student coming in who, for instance, missed Unit 1, you can go ahead and start them on Unit 2. Testing units out of order is allowed in cases of makeup testing, so that student can continue and test with their classmates. A couple things to note. Common error we saw last year was for math tests in 7th grade and high school. Note that there is a calculator and a non-calculator section within the first unit. When students come to the end of the non-calculator section, they should check their work, and move on to the calculator section independently. The sections are not timed, and the test administrator does not have to intervene except to give the student a calculator if they're using a handheld calculator. And the directions on the screen and in the test directions should explain this. But last year, what we saw is, especially since it's in Unit 1, if the test administrator wasn't familiar with the fact that there was a section break, in some instances, folks got confused a little bit. And when the student got to the section break, the test administrator thought, oh, it looks like you're done. Okay, go to lunch. See you later. But actually, the student was only halfway through the unit. So they left that second half of the unit unanswered. And that's something we want to avoid this year. So when you're training your test administrators for math in 7th grade and high school, make sure they're anticipating this section break. One other thing, ELA field testing in grades 4 and 7, which I mentioned earlier. All DC students in grade 4 and 7 will take an additional unit of the ELA assessment to accommodate field test items, and participation is required. And the timing of these items is noted below, but it's also in the field test appendix of the test administrator manual and the test coordinator manual. So these units, the one wrinkle is that they will appear as just Unit 3 in Pearson Access Next, but do note that there are 2 sections that should be treated as separate units. And so we call these Unit 3A and 3B, and these can be administered in separate sittings. So be sure that your test administrators giving ELA to grades 4 and 7 are anticipating this 4th field test unit. Before I throw it back to Lanisha for administering accommodations, I'll take a quick moment to answer some questions that have popped up. We do have a question. If a test administrator has to unlock a test, does that mean the laptop can be in the room during the test? Yes, for computer-based testing, test administrators may have a laptop for the purposes of administering the test. That's something we cover in the security guidelines. It's something that's fairly new with computer-based testing. You shouldn't have a computer or any electronics in the room for paper-based testing. But if you are a test administrator for a computer-based test, you may have a computer to look at that student's in-session screen, do the lock-unlock, and monitor student tests from the virtual side. One thing to note as a best practice during testing, though, well, actually, as a rule, just because you have a laptop doesn't mean you can be on your email, doesn't mean you can be grading papers or doing other work or anything like that. Computer devices in the room during testing should only be used for the purposes of testing. We don't want to come in for monitoring and see anybody reading a magazine or scrolling through Twitter or anything like that. Last year, we had 0 instances from DC of pictures being taken of the test and posted on Twitter, which sometimes we did see from other states. So we want to keep that perfect record going and be very cautious about things like cell phones and computers during testing. But test administrators are allowed computers. Does non-calculator affect students with accommodations? So for a non-calculator unit of the test, if the student has an accommodation for a calculator, that means that they can have a handheld calculator in any unit of the test. So for student with a calculator accommodation, that calc non-calc thing doesn't really apply. It just means that you'd want to have a handheld calculator available for that student. In terms of more information about proctor caching, there's tons of information on park.pearson.com under technology setup if you want to go look it up for yourself. Or we have a webinar coming up on Monday that was just announced in our LEA Look Forward on technology setup, and that will also be posted, the recording, on our website. So you can both go to park.pearson.com for lots of technology information, or you can tune in for our webinar next Monday. In terms of scheduling, how can you find out which of the 3 test windows your school is scheduled for? That really is the choice of the LEAs you serve. So if you're serving students from DC Public Schools, DCPS, their test window is April 11th to May 20th, computer test window number 3. If you're serving other LEAs, they might be testing in other windows. So it's really at the school LEA level. I would say most likely you're in computer test window number 3 because that is where most of our LEAs are testing. But that's another one where you should follow up with your LEA. And if you serve multiple LEAs and they have different windows, choose one for yourselves. And then when you submit your school test plan to each of those LEAs, you'll note the actual dates of your testing. Great, and with that, I'll turn it back over to Lanisha to talk about administering accommodations.
Great, everyone, thank you. So on the day of testing, on the day of testing, your students and their test administrators should all know and be comfortable with the accommodations and accessibility features they will receive or administer. So just make sure that you prepare all special materials, assistive technology, extra calculators, headphones, way ahead of time. And be sure to pay special monitoring attention to students with accommodations at the beginning of the test to ensure that they are receiving all of their correct accommodations. The Park Accommodations Manual that I mentioned a little bit earlier is extensive and provides step-by-step implementation guidance for each accommodation or accessibility feature. The new format that they have is useful because it breaks it down according to how we've done this training in a way by highlighting considerations and actions to be taken before, during, and after testing implementation. Bonnie's going to explain about how to fix errors in the PNP, and thank you all so much.
So one thing we did want to highlight is how to fix a PNP error during testing. So it's not uncommon last year. We know that you're juggling a lot of accessibility features and accommodations, but this is a high impact error because if you don't catch it early, it could cause a student to lose their work or be invalidated if they're not given an accommodation that they're entitled to, or if they're given the wrong accommodation. Obviously, the best thing to do is to prevent the problem by finalizing all your P&P information in the system before downloading the tests and proctor caching or starting any test sessions. But if you do encounter this issue, there's full step-by-step guidance available on Avocet. But I do quickly want to walk you through the steps to fixing a P&P error once you get to the point of testing. So if you're in a situation where the student sits down, they enter their test ticket, they're unlocked, and they get into the test, and then they realize, like, hey, I'm supposed to have text-to-speech, and I don't see text-to-speech here, and it's not working, that means that the actual test form that the student has received has been assigned incorrectly. And what you'll basically need to do then is retrace your steps and start from scratch. The first thing you'll need to do, or one of the things you'll need to do, is submit a test security incident form and a void request to us at OSSI if the test has been opened. So if it's Unit 1 and they've opened it and it's got the wrong accommodations, we need to know what happened and that that test should be voided because it's not correct for the student, so it doesn't move forward to scoring or anything. You're going to mark the test complete in the Students in Session screen, and then you're going to go all the way back to Manage Student Tests, that first step when you were creating a student, and assign a new test in that subject. Enter the correct P&P information, place that test in a test session, verify the form assignment, print a new test ticket, and start a new test. And refresh your proctor cache while you're at it. So as you can see, it's a lot of steps if you get to the point where a student opens the test and they don't have the correct type of computer-based accommodation loaded in there. Unfortunately, it's not as easy as, just turning text-to-speech on and off. You really do have to go back and retrace a few steps in order to fix this one. But we do want to make sure, since it's so critical that students with accommodations get what they need, that you know these steps. And we're also here to support LEAs in schools and make sure that if you encounter these things, you know how to fix it so that students can have an equitable testing experience. One other thing, I just want to show you real quick how to mark a student test complete. This is something you wouldn't only do if you discover a P&P error. This is also something you might do if, for instance, a student didn't log out correctly. I'm going to show you that right now. And you know the student isn't coming back to the test and you want to make sure that they are marked as complete. So for instance, if this student were in active or exited status, red or green, for their third unit, and I knew that they were complete and not coming back to the test, I might want to mark that test complete. So what I would do is go back here and do a little check mark next to the student. You'll notice a theme in the way Pearson Access Next works. A lot of check marking and going back up to the task screen. And then under tasks, I would choose Mark Student Test Complete and click Start. And so you'll see, since the first two units have already been marked complete, I can't mark them complete again. But for the third unit, I can select it. And it will force you to do a reason P&P error, for example, and mark complete. And now you'll see mark complete and the reason below it. Marking a reason is not sufficient as an incident report. So we do, if a student will be given a new test and had a P&P error that interrupted their testing, that is an example of something where we would want to see an irregularity report, so we can mark that test as void. All right, and with that, we'll go on to student logout procedures. So when you have this PowerPoint, there's a link to step-by-step guidance on Avocet on logout procedures. One great thing about this logout procedures document to note is that that is an example of something that you can have in the room during testing. So you can share that step-by-step guidance with screenshots with your test administrators so that when students are done, they can walk them through it. And as we mentioned earlier, if students finish early, they can be dismissed or they can do other things quietly. So your test administrators, as the unit comes to a close, will probably be circulating the room and sort of helping students one by one, making sure that they can log out correctly. You can also give students this logout direction, but I think, for most students it might be a little bit too much information, but it would be a good thing to include in your test administrator training. So basically this is some screenshots of what the students will see. They're going to come to the end of a section and submit it, and it'll give them a warning. So this is what they'll see on the break between the calculator and the non-calc sections if they're in 7th grade or high school. And you'll get a final warning. And then you'll click the person button in the upper right side of the screen to log out. There's also an option to save and return later or do a final test submission. The other thing we want to cover is makeup test administration. So it is inevitable that over the course of testing, you'll have some students absent or who can't test for whatever reason on their scheduled day. And so you're going to need to sort of plan for makeup testing. So when you're putting together your test schedule, make sure you set aside days or times in which you're going to administer makeup test sessions. You may administer makeup tests to mixed grades of students. Just as I mentioned before, pay special attention to test time and directions. And as I mentioned before, for makeup testing, students may take units out of order to continue testing with their groups. Just make sure you unlock the correct unit for each student. So if you have all the students moving on to Unit 2 and you have one student who hadn't started Unit 1 yet, make sure that you're unlocking Unit 2 for her and not Unit 1. So there are two options to sort of organize makeup test sessions in the system, and there's step-by-step guidance linked here. But to summarize, option 1 is you leave the student in his or her original test session, and during the makeup test period, the test administrator may unlock the session they missed. And so if you have students in the makeup testing room from 5 different original testing groups, it just means that the test administrator might be managing students in multiple different sessions. That might actually be the norm already if you have students from different LEAs or different states in the same room. So option 1 might be easiest, to just leave students in their original test session. They use their original student testing ticket, and the test administrator just manages multiple makeups. And you would note in your test security file when students completed their makeup testing and what the makeup test groups were. Option 2 is taking all the students who need makeup tests when they get to that makeup test period on your schedule in a grade in an LEA into a new session that you create, and you add .m or .makeup at the end of the test session name to note that. And in this case, if you're moving students to a new session, you'll need new testing tickets printed for that session. And to move students who may have a semi-completed test from one session to another, here we are back at my sample sessions. So if I wanted to take the student and if she had a semi-completed test and I wanted to move her, I would check mark her name here in Students and Sessions, and I would choose Move Students Between Sessions under Tasks. And here I could choose the session that I wanted to add to her. Now, I don't yet have any other grade 8 ELA sessions set up for this school, so it's not giving me anything to add for her. I can also create a session from this screen. So if I wanted to create a separate makeup session in the system for her, I could do that too. So that's how you move students between sessions in the case of makeup or just in the case of a change in your testing group. And as a state, we don't really have a strong preference either way. There are pros and cons in terms of what's easier. Generally, I think option 1 might be a little easier simply because you don't have to print new student testing tickets or refresh your cache. You just need to make sure that the test administrator knows that they'll be managing students from multiple sessions in the system in the same makeup room. And finally, who to call and how to get help for during testing. Just a reminder of some of those key links. The technology error codes and troubleshooting link would be a good one to bookmark. One thing to note, if you had any trouble last year with our support center, know that we have all new folks and an all new subcontractor running that support center. So they're there to help you by phone, email, or live chat support. During testing, if you're a school site, we'd really strongly encourage you to route questions through your LEA test coordinator so that they're aware of anything that's going on and they can provide sort of your first line of defense. But if you have general questions, you can also direct them to OSSI.assessment. You can also, we're the folks you turn to mostly for support and guidance on test admin policy, questions about your test plan and test security, or sort of real-time troubleshooting, what do I do now? Or if you have gotten a sort of insufficient technical answer from Pearson and you want that flagged and followed up on, we can do that for you as well. So this year we have a new system where we're using the OSSI support tool to track issues during testing and correspond with LEAs securely. So we're doing a training on the OST. I know that many non-publics already use the OST, the OSSI support tool for SEDS issues. So it's all still in that same portal. We've just added a number of assessment topics as something you can submit a question on and get a response on. So that's new this year. Oh, so as we wrap up during testing, a couple questions that I want to address that are popping up. Is there a PBA and EOI, or is there just one test this year? So apologies if that wasn't clearly communicated at the beginning, but yes, there is one test this year. No more PBA and EOI, one test design. And you can turn back towards our scheduling test sessions to see the number of sessions within the number of sections and the number of units. So that is all both in our test coordinator manual and on the testing times document on our website and in this training. So multiple places you can find out the timing of the units. All right, now we're going to move on to after testing, and this is going to be a very brief slide, very brief section. A, because with computer-based testing, there really isn't too much to do after testing is all done, and B, because we know that for most of you, after testing will be in late May, and we'll probably be sending out reminders and sending out additional guidance. So we know that this is a lot of information to take in at once, but we'll do a quick overview of after testing. The first thing you're going to want to do is stop all your sessions. So you'll remember the start button from earlier. Click that again to stop all your sessions. And you're not going to, the system's going to give you an error unless all your students are in complete or marked complete status. So that's another opportunity to make sure that all your students who need makeup testing have done it, and that any student, if you get to the very end of your window and there are students who, you know, we know chronic absenteeism is an issue, students who were not physically in the building and not able to test, and you know they're not going to be returning for testing, you can mark them complete like I showed you earlier. You're going to take all your student testing tickets and all your used scrap paper and securely shred it. So that's not something we require you to ship back to us. For any paper-based tests, You're going to want to ensure that student information is complete on all the test booklets. So on the answer documents, you're going to bubble in all the student information and just follow instructions in the test administrator and test coordinator manuals to ship back scoreable and non-scoreable materials. So that'll go back in 2 separate boxes, answer booklets and test booklets. One thing to note, just because of the way that Pearson, our test vendor, organizes information, if you are doing paper-based tests for students from DC and Maryland and multiple LEAs, those all need to go back in different boxes. Never ever mix up those student tests in the same box. We did encounter some limited instances of that last year, just because the way Pearson organizes those paper test booklets for scoring, they really need the codes on the boxes to match the testing organization. So if you have students from different testing organizations, they're going to need to be in different boxes when you send back the completed tests. Close out any documentation, any incidents that you still need to report. There will be a data cleanup and verification process. That's something we mostly do with the LEAs, but schools might be involved in that. And finally, as Jessica mentioned way back at the beginning of this training, you're going to complete and send affidavits to OSSE as a school test coordinator and archive your records for your school test file. Before we move on, we're not quite done yet. We're going to do a few things to note on DC Science, but are there any questions about Park? Please do enter them in the question box. Great. And one thing I realized I didn't note earlier that I do want to point you towards. Back at the school test coordinator training site, there's something called the test coordinator training scavenger hunt activity. And this is something that we did in our live training sort of interactively. It's a Word document, but it takes you through all the different websites you're going to need during testing and where you can find all these resources. So for instance, I know I've mentioned Avocet a bunch of times. This scavenger hunt directs you towards Avocet. I know I've also mentioned the test coordinator manuals. Those are available on Avocet. So you'll see here I'm going to park.pearson.com, and under manuals and training, the first link is view Avocet. And that is sort of the document repository for all these guidance documents, all these step-by-steps, and all the manuals and scripts. So all that's available to you publicly online, no login information needed. And right below, you'll see test administrator and test coordinator manuals. Now, these will be sent to your school building automatically several weeks prior to testing. But if you want to get a head start now, you can go ahead and download the test coordinator or test administrator manuals that are needed. One during testing question that someone's asked: what do you do with students that come late to school? Are they allowed to enter the test mid-unit? The answer to that is generally no. Once you start testing, you really don't want people entering or exiting the room unless they're absolutely needed. If a student comes late, you should have a plan during testing for where that student can go until their classmates are done. It's something to note in your testing schedule. Many schools won't start testing until 10 just to allow time for students who might be late to school. But once the units start, you shouldn't have any students coming in or out. And also, since it is a timed test, you don't want that student who comes late to have less time than their classmates simply because they were late. Another thing to note in regards to test timing is, since many of you have students with accommodations, maybe they all have extended time. Students with extended time as an accommodation are entitled generally to at least one school day per unit. You're not allowed to extend a unit over multiple school days, but you can have up to one full school day per unit. And that's one of the many things that Lanisha and I covered in our accommodations webinar this past Monday, which is already posted on our website. So a few things I'd like to cover about science, DC Science. Again, this is for students in grades 5, 8, and high school biology. DC Science is also managed in Pearson Access Next, all the same system. There will be verification done in, I believe, April, and we'll lead that from the state level. So don't worry yet about adding your students for science. Still got plenty of time to do that, and the state will be handling most of it. This year, this is new. Last year, there wasn't any paper version of DC Science available. This year, there is a paper version available of DC Science as an accommodation only. And when you order that paper version, there'll be an email ordering process. It won't be the same ordering process as PARCC. And those student responses must be transcribed into the online platform after they're done. Also new this year for DC Science, we don't have full text-to-speech available in DC Science, but we do have an audio form available as an accommodation. So the audio form is basically an electronic read-aloud. It doesn't have all the technical bells and whistles of text-to-speech, but for purposes of a read-aloud accommodation, it's an equivalent electronic version. Last year's science test had a slightly different test design because it was an operational field test. This year for DC Science, it's a two-part test. Each part is 1 hour. So you can either administer that as a 2-hour test, or you can split up and do 1 hour one day, 1 hour the next, 1 in the morning, 1 in the afternoon, whatever works for you. Unlike PARCC, there is going to be a seal code required between Part 1 and Part 2. So that is the one caveat to what I said earlier about no more seal codes for PARCC. There are seal codes for DC Science. And so this is just an example of how that will look different on the screen. So on the lower left, that's what PARCC looks like with Unit 1, 2, 3. On the upper right, that's what DC Science is going to look like, just one status per test. And since it's just a two-part test, the student will be in exited status between Part 1 and Part 2. We're going to do a science-specific webinar on April 4th, so do mark your calendars for that if you'd like to attend, and that'll cover a lot of these differences between PARCC and DC Science in more detail. We put it at the end here because for 90% of all the procedures, PARCC and DC Science are the same. There are just these few things that differ. If you have students who need to receive the audio form for DC Science, so maybe they're receiving text-to-speech for PARCC and you'd like them to get the audio form for science, the way in which you do that is when you're setting up the test session for the student, under form group type, you would choose audio. And that would ensure that when the student logs into the test, everyone in that session gets the audio form of the test. And here for your reference is just an example of what the seal codes will look like between Part 1 and Part 2. And you'll download the seal codes at the same time that you download student testing tickets. That will be one of the documents in the download resources that you download from the Students in Session screen, just for DC Science. So here are some important dates for science. The test administration webinar on the 4th. We also have a paper test window, a student test registration window opening in April, and the testing window running from May 2nd to June 3rd. So unlike PARCC, there aren't multiple options. There's just one large test window, and schools set their own testing dates within that window. And here's just an example of what the audio form is going to look like. And there'll be more on that in our test administration webinar. So some next steps. Here's a link to the accommodations webinar series that we've mentioned a couple different times. The deadline for submitting school test plans is 15 calendar days prior to testing for the state, but make sure you submit to each of your LEAs with enough time to submit to OSSI. So if you haven't already spoken to your contacts at DCPS or various charter schools about your school test plan, I suggest you do so. The Science Test Administration webinar is coming up on April 4th. And a couple things that I'll also add here. This coming Monday, which I believe is the 7th, we'll be having our technology webinar. And the information for that went out in this week's LEA Look Forward. And I can add the link to that when I send out these slides by the end of the day tomorrow. And finally, we'll end with a summary of contact information for everyone on our team. Here is the ossi.dc.gov site where the test coordinator training will be posted. Our general inbox for general questions, we encourage you to use it. But if you need specific follow-up, here is all our information. And as a reminder, Jessica gave the test security training earlier. My name is Bonnie O'Keefe, and you can contact me with Park Tech Policy and Admin questions, and you can contact Lanisha Adams with questions about accommodations. But for schools in general, please route questions through your LEA to make sure your LEA might have certain policies and procedures that we're not aware of. We can only give the sort of state perspective. But for non-publics, if you're having trouble getting in touch with anyone at your LEAs and you need some guidance, please do reach out to us. All right, we'll stick around for a moment to answer any questions that come in. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day, and thank you so much for attending this webinar, and we'll follow up in writing to some of these questions that came up. And keep an eye out for further guidance and FAQs as we get closer to testing. Thank you so much.